Good morning, Jasmine. All right, I'll wait a couple more minutes and see if anyone else shows up, and then I'll start the lecture. Well, good morning, guys. I'm going to go ahead and get going. It's about 10:01, and what I'm going to do is you guys can chime in or text questions if you want. That's okay. Pardon me. Get my chat on here. Can you guys hear me okay? You can give me a thumbs up or okay, yes, in the morning, in the chat. Yes, awesome. Thank you, guys. All right, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce you to the larger, I'm going to make a number of arguments, not arguments, but what I want to do is I want to kind of map a terrain or map a kind of area of understanding visual art and by extension, digital art. And in many respects, the ways in which digital technology has become, sorry guys, I'm gonna turn these lights off, become more of a social metaphor as much as a commercial venture for buying and selling things. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to show you guys a lecture that I put together, and it's the first module of our class is called Visual Fluencies, and I'll do my best to paint this picture for you because it's this. What I want to do eventually is show you guys that you're way more fluent in seeing and reading the world than you know. And one example, more often than not, I try to, when I'm in a class, what I do is I ask my students, well, are you really good at something? And usually there's something like yes, that could be anything like volleyball, drawing, you know, cooking, something like that. And then I ask, have you ever tried to teach somebody something that you're so good at, you don't even have to think about it? And the answer is usually yes. Sometimes it goes well, but more often than not, it doesn't really go well. And part of it is the reason it doesn't go well when you're trying to teach somebody something is that you're so far above and so many levels deep into that expertise that you've kind of forgotten how to step the explanation out. And so what I'm going to argue is that you guys are that way as well with regard to reading and seeing images. One of the easiest ways to explain this would be enjoying memes or TikTok videos. Part of the way that we enjoy those things is because we're so fluent at reading different representations that we forget how we got to that understanding of that representation. And so what I'd like to do in this project is to slow reading of images down to show you, or at least to help you name some of the processes that you use when you, I want to avoid the word consuming, but when you consume or when you look at images, but the consumption of images is just one way of looking at it. So let me go ahead and get this going. I'll do my, here's the thing guys, I have a bunch of images in here, but I have a single screen and I haven't quite figured out how to observe my notes. So what I'll do is I will, I'll make a PDF of the Visual Fluencies lecture. And in that PDF, we'll have the citations and the sources of all the images that I'm using so that if you're interested, you can look them up and find out more. Oh, that's a terrible slide. Okay. Okay. Okay, so the first thing that I thought I would start out with is something really basic, Kenny. Kenny always dies. And all he is just this flat, two-dimensional series of shapes and lines. And we read that as a person. And not only that, if you've ever watched this show, you'll know that his pals kind of don't care about him, sort of, I don't know. But we have this investment in these shapes and lines and spots now. And we can tell stories about those shapes and lines and spots. And we have a shared experience of these lines and shapes and spots that we call Kenny. And we can talk about that when we go to work or go to school or whatever, right? So one of the questions I have for you guys is, how do we get that visceral, or rather, where does that visceral kind of intensity come from when we're looking at artwork or imagery? This is an image that really impacted me when I was young. I was learning printmaking many years ago, and Kat Kolwitz had an exhibit I was in Italy at the time. And while I was learning how to do this when I was 18 or whatever, 19, I couldn't believe when I saw finished reproductions of, or rather finished artwork. This can't even hold a candle to the real thing. But one of the beautiful things that I love about this image is how heart-wrenching it is. And the more I found out about Frida Kahlo, the more the emotion of this image came through. Did I say Frida Kahlo? I meant Kati Kollwitz. Please excuse me. Kati Kollwitz lost, I think, her sons in war, World War I and World War II. And this piece really speaks to that kind of, for me anyways, speaks to that kind of sorrow and longing and kind of desperation, you know, of sadness. But I'm reading that into the picture. If I really just look at the picture with a cold eye, right? I could just say, well, it's a bunch of black lines on a black on a white image on a white paper. And you could argue that what I see here and how I read this is up to me, right? Which also tends to foster a somewhat lazy presumption that it's just my opinion, therefore it's unarguable, right? Which, you know, we can argue, we can, here's some information about it coming up here. All right, this is an image by Richard Misrack. Also another very visceral image. I wish I could talk to you guys in like real person, but I'll just pretend like, I realize that we're in kind of doing kind of a passive, you know, exchange here, but this image is a dead horse. Richard Misrack is a photographer who did a lot of work recording, photographing parts of the western deserts of the United States in the Southwest. And you'll find all kinds of interesting things out in the desert. Just drive east, and within about a half an hour, the landscape will change into these rocky boulders and dry kind of you know, scrubland. There's a lot in the desert that is really beautiful. Among the things that I love the most about going to the desert is the silence and that lack of kind of cities noises like cars and trains and boats and all the rest of it. So this image is a photograph. And so, but one of the arguments I want to make to you as a, and I'm going to try to make this case as clearly as I can. One of the arguments that I want to make to you, or one of the assumptions that I want to bring to your attention, is that we are reading this picture just as we read the image of Kati Kollwitz of the mother and child, dead son. But this is a photograph, and so whereas in the image of Kati Kollwitz's, we realize somebody made that, right? And that whether we don't ask whether or not it really happened or whether or not it's true, we understand that etching or that drawing as somebody's composition of an idea, right? Or a composition of of an emotion, or however you want to call it. In photography, however, there's something that happens which I think is really neat, in that we look at images originally in the same way that we might look at a Kati Kollwitz or a drawing or a painting. In other words, somebody was there and they actually created that thing. But there's also this intermediary called the camera, whereas in your drawing, it's a pencil, and this time it's the camera. And because it's a machine and it has optics and that kind of thing, and because there's a kind of a metaphysical difference between what I know about a pencil and what I know about a camera, I tend to trust the camera a little bit more in terms of whether or not it's true, whether or not this thing actually happened. And so I don't ask of Kathy Kolwitz's image, which is this, whether or not that actually happened, because it doesn't really rise to the, it doesn't really rise in my mind to, it doesn't matter whether it happened or not. It's a very powerful image. But what I do know is that something real prompted this picture, something real prompted this person to make that image, right? And let me see if I can get this to skip. Sorry, we got to go through this again. Oh, well. Back here. Okay, guys. In the Richard Misrack image, what we're looking at is a photograph, and one of our relationships with photography has to do with the presumption of truth, or the presumption that that thing actually happened at one point in time. Now, later on, we start getting into using photography as in the United States and other places in the early part of the 20th century as sources of evidence to solve crimes and stuff like that, or as we start later using radio photography and stuff like that to do x-rays and heal people, right? And in this case, we're just looking at an image of a horse. And so there's all these different types of there are all these different kinds of processes that we're bringing to bear on this picture that we read it with. And what I'd like to do in this lecture is to try to tease out and name some of those conventions that we use when we are looking at images and we're consuming the content of the image. I'm wondering if I have another scrolling credit here. Oh, there's the Richard Misrack. I'll just let this play for the video. If you guys watch it, you can fast forward or pause it. I'm trying to get this to forward on, guys. So. Okay, so one of the questions I had was, where does that power come from? And I wanted to ask whether or not a poem could also have that kind of power. And I'll just let you read this. This is an excerpt from a poem called For Each of You. Let me go back. If you do not learn to hate, you will never be lonely enough to love easily, nor will you always be brave, although it does not grow any easier. Do not pretend to convenient beliefs, even though they are righteous. You will never be able to defend your city while shouting. Remember that our sun is not the most noteworthy star, only the nearest. My gosh, this is slow. Respect. Oh, good gravy. Sorry, guys. I'm getting impatient. Here we go. I think I just have a really slow transition on this. Here we go. And respect whatever pain you bring back from your dreaming, but do not look for new gods in the sea, nor in any part of a rainbow. Each time you love, love as deeply as if it were forever, only nothing is eternal. Speak proudly to your children wherever you may find them, and tell them you are the offspring of slaves and your mother was a princess in darkness. And so this is a poem by Audre Lorde, 1970. Obviously, it's toward a particular audience, but I think that that power can come through. It does for me. And I really, you know, the question about whether or not one is better than another is the same thing about comparing like the Harry Potter books to the Harry Potter movies, right? It's kind of the wrong question because they're different forms of storytelling. So one of the, and again, with regard to the class, I'm trying to kind of lay a foundation about perception and the way we read the world. So do we presume that there's a meaning in the world, right? And there's a lot to go over with this, but one of the things I want to mention is that it's no accident that we look at the world and we ask, what does that mean? Until we get to the Enlightenment, where people say, you know, maybe a rock is just a rock and it doesn't mean anything, and it's not some sign that, you know, God or someone put it there. And when natural philosophy turned into science after the Enlightenment and kind of coalesced into a more kind of, how can I put it? It became kind of split off into these multitudes of epistemologies that we understand the world with. And some of them are scientific, some of them are metaphysical, some of them are spiritual, and so on. So these are different sort of lenses through which we read the world, right? And that's one of the arguments that I'm making to you guys, is that we more often than not read the world through a lens that we have become so used to seeing through that we no longer notice that it's a lens. And here's what I wanted to show you guys. All right. So one of the ways that it was kind of brought to my attention was through the understanding, or very basic understanding, of semiotics. And semiotics is a very varied field, and it is the study of signs and things out in the world and what they mean and how that stuff means what it means, you know, to us. Semiosis, and I'll get into this more, is the emergence is the emergence of meaning or reading from signifiers. So for example, a signifier is a thing that points to a meaning somewhere. What is signified is the meaning itself. So for example, if I have a rose and the rose is growing out of concrete in a downtown city, LA maybe, that rose we might read as being symbolic of power or perseverance or something like that, right, in that scenario. So the rose in that case is a signifier of persistence or maybe love. Love is the signified thing that the rose is kind of pointing to, meaning-wise, in, say, a particular composition. Now, the artist is the person who comes along and says, oh, look, I'm noticing meaning there. Let me just draw a frame around it with my camera, or maybe I'll draw it with a pencil and kind of focus in on just the one bit that I want to communicate to people. And more often than not, what artists do, we notice things and we tend to frame them and re-present them to other people so that we can show them what moved us or what, you know, got us excited in the first place. And one of the ways in which we do this on a regular basis is through conventions. And one of the arguments that I want to make to you, and one of the things I want you to hopefully try to notice, is that when it comes to looking at artwork and including staring at a screen like we're doing right now, or listening to some audio coming out of your computer or your phone or whatever you're using, is that we rely on visual conventions to communicate through these slabs of glass every single day. And that those conventions are not culturally neutral. Those conventions of communication, those visual conventions come from a particular habit of understanding the world. Okay, now I'm not trying to, you know, paint some big brother picture out there like there's a cabal of people, you know, deciding what we see and what we don't see, but I'll leave that up to you. Whoa, this is kind of going on its own here. Please stand by. Well, I guess I'm, all right, hold on. Give me a sec, guys. Lost control of my own slideshow. All right, I may end up having to do it this way. So a metaphor is one thing that makes you think of another thing because they have common characteristics. And so this is one of the first conventions of language, and also a convention that's a visual convention that we'll use to understand how images work. So in this example, if I say something like, he was a mountain of a man, we know that that doesn't mean that this person was a mountain, but that they probably have characteristics that are akin to mountainess or mountainhood, whatever you want to call it. And one of the things that that relies on is an essentialist understanding about what a mountain is, as though a mountain has an ideal mountainous somewhere out there, maybe like K2 or Mount Everest or Mount Hood or whatever perfect mountain you have in your head. That's the mountain that you're going to use to bring to bear on the reading of this man, right? This is Dohosa. This is called Sum-won. He's a artist of Korean descent and from Korea, and relocated to the United States. I think he lives in New York now. And let me get this picture. I'm afraid of making it too big because I don't want it to just automatically play. But hopefully, if it does, I'll just exit out. But what you see here, these are, oh great. What you see, well, that's David Hammond's. Okay, so what we're seeing here, you guys, is all of these items. These are dog tags. These are military dog tags, and there's a mandatory conscriptive military service for young men in South Korea. And inside there are it's like a reflection, there are images. And so what's beautiful is that there are all these dog tags, and you literally have to walk on these dog tags to see this piece. Now, these are dog tags that have created the shape of a coat of arms, right? And then there's arms. And so you start thinking about the notion, what is an arm? An arm is an arm, but it also refers to weaponry, right? And so metaphorically, what we're doing is he's using the characteristics of one thing and bringing it as a lens or as a little tweak to reading something else. And so this might have something to do with individuality or lack thereof, our ability to join institutions or join organizations and subsume part of our own individuality within that whole. And then the question is, if that whole becomes an individual, like a corporation, is it accountable, right? Who is it then that we go to if it sort of dissipates once we start looking close? I have a better photo of this, but this is from a series called Spade series by David Hammonds. And David Hammonds is an African-American artist. And I'm mentioning it because the origin of this work came from a very old-fashioned derogatory term for a Black person called a spade. He couldn't figure out why people were called spades. And so what he did was he took spades, which is a literal spade of a shovel, right? And which also, it has a double entendre or a double meaning, where this word spade is also used as a epithet. But he takes it and he starts to use these shovels as references to African masks. And so if you start to look at this, you start to see hints of an African mask coming through, a ceremonial mask. And these are all very intentionally done, because what he's doing is he's signifying the African mask through the use of other materials, and also through the way that he's draping them. It could also be the way, how high they're hung on the wall. Are they at head height, right? So they suddenly stop becoming what they are for a moment, but they communicate on a multivalent level different meanings, right? So at the one hand, you have an African-American artist using an object whose name was used as a racial epithet, and then reconfiguring that insult into something beautiful that harkens back to something more regal and culturally rich. Irony. So irony, what I'm doing is I'm mapping linguistic lenses or conventions to visual conventions. So irony is a mode of speech where the meaning is kind of contrary, or it seems like it's the opposite of what is really meaning. But more often than not, the irony has to do with making a value judgment in some way, or noticing the futility or the mismatch between effort and results. This is an artist named Jeff Koons, and this is Michael Jackson and his chimp Bubbles. I think his chimp's name was Bubbles. This was done in 1990, around 89, 1990. I saw this in real life in Venice, Italy. It's quite large, it's huge. It's at least twice, 3 times the size of a normal human. And it's ceramic, and at that point, Jeff Koons, as an artist, I think he was like a trader of some kind, like a financial trader, but I'll back that up with evidence. What's unique about his art is that he ends up taking an ironic stance to begin with about art in general. And so the art that he makes also points an ironic eye towards popular culture. And so creating this kind of oversized, like a tchotchke or like a yadro kind of thing that you might put on your mantelpiece, he's putting in our face the absurdity of pop culture and pop culture's demands upon people's notion of well-being, of wealth, success, and so on. Synecdoche, kind of a fancy pants word, but it's a really handy word. It's one thing that makes you think of another thing, because the one thing is a part of whole of another thing, right? So for example, if I say like the state, right? The state. Well, we know a state is actually just a state, but when we talk about the state, we're talking about the entirety maybe of a government or of a country filled with states, right? So let me give you a visual example. This is 16 Jackies. And if you're familiar with who Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy is, she was the wife of JFK, who was assassinated in Texas by gunshot in a convertible car. She was sitting next to him when this happened. So this was a national tragedy along the lines of 9/11. And it really affected people very, very deeply, that kind of a magnitude. And so when we look at this image, and of course, this is an image that's also rooted in our historical awareness. So if you're not aware of this, and as time marches on, people become less and less aware of historical events and their signifiers that were important to one generation or another, right? So in this case, we're seeing Jackie Kennedy here, 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 and she's smiling in the upper left corner. And when we look at Jackie Onassis, we not only just think of her, but we also think of the entirety of the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy family, power, Washington, that kind of stuff. And here you can see she's very sad, and she has the veil, she has like a veil pulled up, dark clothes, and she's quite solemn and sad. And so that pulls up for us the part to whole relationship between her as now a signifier of this whole scenario of the JFK assassination and the Kennedys in general, as opposed to just looking at this picture of a woman with different emotions on her face who we don't know. Okay, so that's the difference. That's part to whole relationship. It is, and all of these are triggered, right? This is Carrie Mae Weems and Blue Notes. This may well be in response to another artist who, John Baldessari, who Carrie Mae Weems is an African-American artist, and her work is very rooted in the observation and the recapitulation or the reification of racist tropes that we just automatically presume are okay in our everyday environment. And the other thing too that I love about Carrie Mae Weems is that her work, it's photographic in nature, filmic in nature. And so she uses a lot of the visual conventions that you would find in movies. And she tweaks them, but she also includes that in that tweak, the fact that she is an African-American woman as an author. And that's very significant. So not only in this case, in here is John Baldessari, who became really famous for putting dots on people's faces, and a brilliant artist in his own right. But one of the things that is different that she calls attention to in her work is the role of the author as visible. So whereas in some art historical practices, if you are the right gender, you're the right race and all that kind of stuff, then your identity is more or less presumed as a norm. And she says, you know what, I can do the same thing, but because my identity is not presumed norm, it becomes a part of the content of the artwork. And it's something that is inescapable, right? So these are part to whole relationships. With Jackie Kennedy, we see that this image is one, not just some random person, but a particular person at a particular part in time. And as such, she operates as a little trigger for all the rest of that stuff to come through. Carrie Mae Weems does the same exact thing here. Instead of circles, she puts squares, and she makes a commentary on what is normative in like the so-called genius art world. Metonymy. These terms are going to be important because we're integrating them into our visual project next. Metonymy is one thing that makes you think of another because there are associations that are triggered. So the key thing here is, whereas in synecdoche, it's a part to whole relationship, metonymy is more associative. It relies on you to kind of put it all together, right? And by the way, these terms overlap. They're not mutually exclusive. One of the ways that metonymy works by association is that, number one, we're fairly selfish people when it comes down to it. And when we read advertising and that kind of thing, one of the key questions is, does it, let's look at shopping mentality. Shopping mentality is, I like it, I don't like it, I don't care, right? Or I'll buy it, I won't buy it, or I might buy it. And so if you map that kind of behavior onto your own visual habits, one of the things you might notice is that over time, these habits will crisscross over into maybe going to a museum. So as opposed to walking through a museum and you look at read the little text on the wall, you'll look at the piece and go, okay, I like it, I don't like it, I don't care, next, next, next. As opposed to looking at something that that is a proposal about the world, right? And so if you look at advertising, advertising uses this in a very sophisticated way. This old Coke ad will go into advertising in our next module, but in this old Coke ad, this is an associative relationship. So the Coca-Cola actually kind of is a very small part of the percentage of the image. What they're really selling here is they're associating Coca-Cola with a particular version of love, a particular version of happiness, and that kind of thing. And so what ends up happening is the relationship between Coca-Cola and this scenario becomes the signifier of Coke, right? It is the thing that is signifying Coca-Cola. This artist is, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting this artist. I'll move on and I'll put it in. I feel terrible. I forgot my notes. This is I do want to come back to this one. So this is, Richard Prince is his name. Richard Prince, it's kind of old fashioned now. He did artwork in the 80s and 90s. And back then there was a big Marlboro campaign, the Marlboro Cowboy, and this is our cigarettes, right? And so, this has to do with the observation of the cooptation of imagery as how potent it is to signify something. So for example, one of the things that he did here is he just photographed very similar cowboys doing cowboy stuff in a way that Marlboro used in their ad campaign of the Marlboro Man, right? And it's an easy trick, and I'm not saying it's easy to do, but I think at the time what he and many other artists were doing was saying, listen, we've really got to start paying attention to the lenses that we're using to look at things. And we should also pay attention to our habits of seeing that we are inheriting from the advertising industry. And so one of the insidious things is that he did this piece, and one of the things that happens in your mind is, oh, it's a Marlboro ad. If you don't even have to smoke to know that. You just have to have been in visual culture and looked at it all over the place. So think about that. You look at something and it will remind you of something, or remind you of like a meme or whatever you've seen. That association is in some respects a kind of an occupation of the mind, right? It's something that's taking up real estate, as they say, in your mind, so that in some respect you cannot just cold eye look at this and go, oh, cowboys having coffee, how nice. But instead you start to associate it with Marlboro. This is a Tommy Hilfiger ad. Again, another metonymic kind of like association where one image, you'll notice here, it's simply just this identity. And these ads are coming from very different eras of advertising, and the strategies are somewhat different. So I don't want to pretend like they're all on the same level, using the same tools the same way, because they're not. But what this image is doing is, I guess, Tommy Hilfiger, you guys may know better than I, but this was an older ad. So there's some classic car in there. So you don't even need to know what kind of car it is. You just need the symbolic kind of reference of chrome, right? This old school kind of classy, whatever, rich and bored, who knows what those guys are doing. Okay. So so those are some of the conventions that we use, or at least that I'm proposing that we think about when we're looking. And when we read things, those are some of the conventions that we use to read things. It would be similar to the way, if you're talking to somebody in a conversation and they use a word in a really terse way, or they say something kind of smarty pants or something, you just like, what? And then you start to read not what they said, but how they said it. And this is the difference between the messenger and the message, okay? I'm bringing this up because, I'll tell you guys another time, but one of the main things I want to talk to you guys about is that as an artist and as a digital artist, you're a messenger, but sometimes the habits of the messages, or the habits that we create messages with, are worth investigating to make sure that we're in more control and aware of how we're crafting our message can change the way the message is received. All right. So guys, I'm going to take a break. And then I'm going to come back in about 5 minutes, and then I'll go through the second part of the video. Plus, this way it'll break up the lecture a little bit video-wise, so we don't have to just go with one video. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'll stop. Whoops. And I'll be back in like 5 minutes. Okay, you guys?